Here's a shocking reality. Most Christian couples today spend more time planning their kids' soccer schedules than they do in prayer together. The shared cooking, daily Bible reading, and family worship that once anchored marriages have quietly disappeared, replaced by a child-centered chaos that's actually making divorce more likely. Today, we're diving deep into how modern couples are abandoning the spiritual practices that Scripture says should bind them together, why putting children at the center of marriage is backfiring spectacularly, and what both psychology and the Bible tell us about rebuilding marriages on the right foundation. By the end of this episode, you'll understand exactly why shared spiritual practices matter and have concrete steps to strengthen your own relationship. Let me bring in someone who's been studying this intersection of faith and family dynamics. Help me understand, what did shared spiritual practices traditionally look like in Christian marriages?
Well, we're talking about three core practices that used to be absolutely central to Christian family life. First, shared cooking and meals, not just eating together, but actually preparing food as a team. Second, daily Bible reading as a couple, not just individual devotions. And third, family worship time where the whole household would pray and study scripture together.
That sounds almost foreign to most couples today. What's the biblical foundation for these practices?
It goes back to Genesis 2:24. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh.
The Bible isn't just talking about physical unity, but complete integration of life. When couples cook together, read scripture together, worship together, they're literally practicing this one flesh principle. But that's not what's happening anymore, is it? What does the research show about how these practices are declining?
The numbers are pretty stark. According to research from France tracking cooking patterns from 1985 to 2010, US households spent 20 minutes less time per day cooking in 2010 than in 1985. That's not just about convenience. It represents a fundamental shift away from shared domestic practices that used to bond couples together.
20 minutes less per day, that adds up to hours per week of lost connection time. And I'm guessing cooking is just the tip of the iceberg?
Exactly. The research shows that the amount of time devoted to preparing food at home has declined in all Western societies over the past decades. But here's what's really concerning. This decline in shared practices is happening alongside a massive shift in family structure. Only about 60% of US children now live with their married biological parents.
Wait, only 60%? That means we're essentially conducting a massive social experiment on family structure. What's driving this change?
Well, there's fascinating research by Dr. Heather Kelly and her team that interviewed 198 couples from various religious traditions. They found that religion can actually be both a unifying force and a dividing force in marriages, depending on three key factors: shared beliefs, shared practices, and community involvement.
So religion isn't automatically helpful for marriages? That's counterintuitive.
Right, it's more nuanced than people think. The study found that shared religious beliefs and practices are linked to trust between spouses and overall marital well-being. But when couples have differing religious beliefs or practices, like one person wanting daily prayer while the other doesn't, it can actually create tension and conflict.
That makes sense. So it's not just about being religious, it's about being religious together. What does the broader research say about spiritual practices and marriage satisfaction?
There's a systematic review published in 2025 that looked at spiritual and cultural beliefs in religious communities. The findings are pretty compelling. Religious and spiritual beliefs promote coping mechanisms, enhance marital satisfaction, and improve mental health outcomes. So socio-demographic factors and religious commitment are key predictors of marital satisfaction and family well-being.
So the science backs up what Scripture has been saying all along. But here's what I'm curious about. You mentioned child-centered marriages earlier. How does that fit into this picture? This is where things get really interesting. When couples abandon shared spiritual practices, they often fill that void by making their children the center of their relationship. But this actually inverts God's design. According to Scripture, the marriage relationship should be the cornerstone that provides stability for children, not the other way around. That's a pretty radical perspective in our culture. Can you break that down more?
Look at 1 Corinthians 11:3, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. There's a clear hierarchy here. Or Ephesians 5:2-24 about wives submitting to husbands as the church submits to Christ. The marriage relationship comes first, then children benefit from that stable foundation.
I can already hear people pushing back on those verses. But what happens when couples flip this order and put kids first?
Well, the research on parental divorce gives us some clues. Studies show that parental separation and divorce are associated with increased risk for child adjustment problems, academic difficulties, disruptive behaviors, depressed mood. Risk typically increases by a factor between 1.5 and 2. When the marriage isn't strong, children suffer.
So putting children at the center actually hurts them in the long run. That's pretty ironic.
Exactly. And here's another piece. Offspring of divorced parents are more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior, live in poverty, and experience their own family instability. We're creating generational patterns of dysfunction when we abandon biblical family structure.
The ripple effects are huge. But let's get practical for a moment. What would it actually look like for a modern couple to rebuild these shared spiritual practices?
Start with the basics that Scripture emphasizes. Proverbs 22:6 says, "Start children off on the way they should go, and even when they are old, they will not turn from it." But notice, it's about starting children off, not centering your marriage around them.
Right, so the parents need to be unified first. What does that look like practically?
Begin with shared cooking, not just eating together, but actually preparing meals as a team. The research shows this creates natural conversation time and shared purpose. Then add daily Bible reading, even just 10 minutes together before bed. Finally, establish family worship time where you pray and study scripture as a household unit.
Those sound simple, but I imagine they're harder to implement than they sound. What are the biggest obstacles couples face?
Time is the obvious one, but it's really about priorities. The research on cooking decline shows that changing labor market incentives only explain about 20% of the decline in home cooking time. The bigger issue is that couples have simply stopped valuing these shared practices.
So it's more about what we choose to prioritize than what we have time for. That's convicting.
And here's what's encouraging. Christian marriage counseling research shows that when couples integrate theological principles with practical relationship skills, they can rebuild these foundations. Marriage therapy that includes biblical teachings helps couples reconnect emotionally, spiritually, and physically.
What does that integration actually look like in practice?
Christian counselors blend spiritual and psychological methodologies. They might use communication techniques from research-backed approaches like emotionally focused therapy, but ground them in biblical principles like 1 Corinthians 13:4-7. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud.
So it's not either psychology or scripture, but both working together. That makes sense given that God created both our minds and our spirits.
Exactly. And the research backs this up. Faith plays a crucial role in relationship dynamics, with spiritual beliefs influencing marital satisfaction and conflict resolution. When couples have that shared spiritual foundation, they have better tools for navigating challenges.
Let's talk about the community aspect for a moment. Dr. Kelly's research mentioned community involvement as one of the 3 key factors. How does that play into this?
Religious communities can either bolster marital unity or introduce challenges, depending on the level of involvement and acceptance. When both spouses are equally engaged in their faith community, it provides support and accountability. But if one partner is more involved than the other, it can create tension.
So even good things like church involvement need to be balanced and mutual. What about couples where one spouse is more spiritually inclined than the other?
That's where the research on differing religious practices becomes really important. The study found that disparate practices, like differences in frequency of worship or engagement in religious rituals, can create imbalances in commitment and shared experiences. It requires intentional work to find common ground.
What would you recommend for couples in that situation?
Start with what you can agree on. Maybe the less spiritual spouse isn't ready for daily Bible reading, but they're willing to cook together or have family dinner without devices. Build from there. The key is creating shared experiences that gradually deepen spiritual connection.
That's really practical. Now, I have to ask about the elephant in the room, those biblical passages about wives submitting to husbands. How do you address that in our current cultural moment?
Look at the full context. Ephesians 5:25-27 says, "Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." It's not about domination, it's about sacrificial leadership. The husband's role is to love his wife the way Christ loved the church, which means dying to himself for her benefit.
So it's mutual submission in different forms, not a power grab. How does this play out in those shared spiritual practices we've been discussing?
When a husband leads in spiritual practices, he's not barking orders. He's initiating prayer time, suggesting Bible study, taking responsibility for the spiritual health of the family. And when a wife responds to that leadership, she's not being passive. She's actively participating in building their spiritual foundation together.
That reframes the whole dynamic. It's about teamwork with different roles, not hierarchy for its own sake.
Right. And here's what's beautiful about this. When couples practice these biblical roles within shared spiritual practices, they're modeling healthy relationships for their children. Proverbs 22:6 becomes lived reality, not just a nice verse on the wall.
Let's zoom out for a moment. We've talked about individual couples, but what are the broader societal implications of this trend away from shared spiritual practices?
The research is pretty sobering. We know that family instability is considered a major public health problem for children. When only 60% of kids live with their married biological parents, we're talking about massive social disruption. Weak families represent a weak society.
And this connects back to those shared practices because they're what actually hold families together in the first place.
Exactly. The systematic review found that spiritual and cultural beliefs significantly enhance marital satisfaction and strengthen family relationships, promoting improved mental health and resilience through effective coping mechanisms. These aren't just nice traditions, they're essential infrastructure for stable families.
So when we abandon these practices, we're not just affecting our own marriages, we're contributing to broader social breakdown. That's a heavy responsibility.
But it's also an incredible opportunity. Every couple that chooses to rebuild their spiritual foundation is contributing to social healing. They're creating a legacy of faith that influences generations to come, just like the Bible talks about in terms of family as a divine institution.
That's actually really hopeful. What would you say to couples who feel overwhelmed by all this? Like, where do they even start?
Start small, but start together. Pick one shared practice, maybe cooking dinner together twice a week. Do that consistently for a month. Then add 5 minutes of prayer before bed. Build slowly, but build together. The research shows that even small shared spiritual practices can have significant impact on marital satisfaction.
And the key word there is together. It's not about individual spiritual growth, it's about shared spiritual growth.
Exactly. Genesis 2:24 talks about becoming one flesh. That's not just physical, it's spiritual, emotional, practical. When couples cook together, pray together, study scripture together, they're literally practicing unity in the most fundamental areas of life.
What about couples who are already struggling? Is it too late to implement these practices if there's already conflict or distance in the relationship?
The research on Christian marriage counseling is really encouraging here. It shows that integrating theological principles with psychological insights can help couples at any stage. Even couples in crisis can rebuild their foundation through shared spiritual practices, though they might need professional help to get started.
That's really hopeful. And I imagine having that external support helps couples navigate the practical challenges of rebuilding these habits.
Absolutely. Christian counselors can help couples identify where their practices diverged, address underlying conflicts about spiritual roles and expectations, and create practical plans for rebuilding shared spiritual life. It's not just about good intentions, it's about having concrete strategies.
Before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about child-centered marriages. What would you say to parents who worry that prioritizing their marriage means neglecting their kids?
The research is clear. Children benefit when their parents have a strong marriage. When couples prioritize their relationship and model healthy spiritual practices, they're giving their children the greatest gift possible, a stable, loving home. Child-centered marriages actually create anxiety and insecurity in kids because they're forced to carry emotional weight they're not designed to bear.
So putting the marriage first is actually the most loving thing you can do for your children. That's a paradigm shift for a lot of parents.
Right. And when children see their parents cooking together, praying together, studying scripture together, they learn what healthy relationships look like. They're getting a front row seat to biblical marriage in action. That's worth more than any amount of scheduled activities or material advantages.
So when you step back from all this research and biblical teaching, here's what really stands out to me. We're not just talking about nice traditions or religious habits. These shared spiritual practices are literally the infrastructure that holds marriages and families together.
Exactly. And the beautiful thing is that God's design actually works. When couples follow biblical principles for marriage, shared spiritual practices, proper roles, putting the marriage relationship first, both the research and scripture show that marriages thrive and children flourish. It's not outdated tradition, it's timeless wisdom.
What gives me hope is that this isn't complicated. We're talking about cooking together, praying together, reading the Bible together, simple practices that any couple can start today.
And here's the thing, when couples commit to these practices, they're not just strengthening their own marriage, they're contributing to the healing of our entire culture. Every strong Christian marriage is a light in the darkness, a testimony to God's design for human relationships.
That brings us back to where we started, those couples spending more time on soccer schedules than prayer schedules. The choice is really that simple.
Will we prioritize what's urgent or what's eternal?
Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts. Remember, your marriage doesn't have to become another divorce statistic. The practices that built strong families for thousands of years are still available today. Start small, start together, and watch God rebuild what our culture has torn down.